run one more clip past you today. It's short and sweet. This is a short from the Deep Drinks podcast called The Ultimate Debunking of William Lane Craig's Apologetic Tactic. Here it is.
If you're going to make the argument that it had to come from something, then so does God. Well, not God. He's outside of that. Why? And there is no why, except that you want him to be the first cause, because that answers your weird, creepy little apologetic tactic. And it simply doesn't work. I think they get the most attention because you can dress them up like William Lane Craig's Kalam it's simple with its premises, but when you actually hear him explain it, he's using so many philosophical terms and really impressive language that you feel like, how do I fight this? How can I break this down? But all he is saying is, my God is the one exception. And it's like, that's not an answer. That doesn't answer anything.
And by the way, Bill, that's another thing that I run into quite often. That is the questioning of your motives. And that's what he's doing here, claiming you're just trying to snow people with big sounding words. That and special pleading?
Well, he seems to think that it's special pleading, but I don't think that he understands the first premise of the argument. The first premise of the argument is that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And the reason that God doesn't need to have a cause is because God didn't begin to exist. So it's not special pleading for God. Any being that never began to exist, that is eternal, it's difficult to see how it could have a cause. It certainly couldn't have a prior cause in time. So God is not an exception to the first premise. We're not saying here's something that began to exist, but it doesn't have a cause. That would be special pleading. That would be making the entity an exception to the first premise. But in this case, that's not what's happening. Rather, God doesn't meet the condition laid down in the first premise for needing a cause, and that condition is that the thing began to exist.
Well, Bill, as we wrap it up, I know you'd probably like to scold these guys for not doing their due diligence. I say that because there's a lot of smirking and snickering and things like that in these videos, but maybe we can offer them some advice. I know the temptation is for them to crank out content to grow their channels, but perhaps they should devote a month or two to examining yours and others' responses to their rebuttals before they crank out a video on the topic.
Yes, I think that would be a good idea, because these are not new objections. These are objections that have been multiply addressed before. But I think there's a lesson too for our listeners, Kevin, that I'd like to highlight here. And that is, do you notice that these fellows, particularly Grayson, didn't give any documentation for their opinions? They just asserted them. And if there's anything that the internet generation has learned, it is to be skeptical about things you hear or see on the internet. Anybody can get on and make assertions. And so whenever you hear people making assertions, you always need to think critically and ask, what is the documentation that he gives for that? In my responses today, I was careful to give documentation to Valenkin's and Hawking and Penrose's statements that our viewers can check out for themselves. And so I would encourage people, when you listen to these popularizers, don't be gullible. Don't think that they're authorities on this matter. Ask for the documentation that supports their assertions before you buy into them too quickly.
The irony. Oh, the irony. Like, touche. He had that quote from Misner, undocumented. He said it was a quote from Hawking and Penrose. It wasn't. It was a quote from Hawking. And it was, he asserted that Carroll's model was unphysical. He didn't provide any argument for it. I mean, on and on. He quotes Valenkin, but he doesn't quote other people that disagree with Valenkin. On and on we can go. I mean,
but even if you had, suppose that all the YouTubers that they watched clips from did give very careful citations. Suppose that were true. Why would that matter? I mean, you can find sources for all the different things that those YouTubers said, but that's not the way that you settle arguments in philosophy or in physics, right? The way that so the only place I can think of where you could settle a dispute with a citation is in when you're doing history. If the question is, what did some particular historical figure think at some particular time? Well, if you can find some citation, some source where they actually tell us what they think, then that would be, that would settle the issue. But in order to settle this issue, it's not enough just to say, oh, in some popular book somewhere, this guy said such and such, I think it's very telling that they talk about who is an authority. There's this kind of religious way of thinking about or conceiving of these issues where what you have to do is you have to appeal to some relevant authority. Well, that's not the way the real academic work is done. You don't go around appealing to authorities to see what we should actually think about some subject. Instead, you go out and you do the careful academic work of digesting the material for yourself. And then after digesting the material for yourself, you figure out how to understand that material, what implications in this case that material has, whether the universe had a beginning. That's what Craig should be doing. And it's, to be fair, what various YouTubers should be doing as well. But instead, Craig wants to know who the right authorities are to go to, as if we were like debating scripture or something, right? Like,
right. At least in this video. I mean, as you know, of our audience should know this, but Dan is extensively engaged with Craig and Sinclair's work, where Craig and Sinclair, try to engage with the science and the scientific literature and whatnot. So, but
even in those places, though, the Craig and Sinclair paper is very strange because there's two of those papers, but they're both very strange because a lot of what they do is they reprint emails that they have received from various physicists. You get the impression that, okay, they tried to understand the science to some level. They got to some point where they felt like they were stuck. And then they just emailed people, lots and lots of people. And those people were patient enough and careful enough to send them back emails. And then instead of bringing those emails into their own understanding and making the material their own, they just included entire paragraphs quoted from those emails. And so again, it's just this game of like, who has the best authorities? And it's like, maybe if you're doing a certain kind of like scriptural exegesis or something, that's an important thing to do. But, outside of exegesis, outside of historical work, I don't think there's really a place for saying, like, which authority should we turn to?
And I would say that in science, the way we decide a controversial issue, if the experts don't all agree, which they don't, is via experiments, right? And as far as I know, there's no data that tells us anything about what happened before the inflationary epoch, if the inflationary epoch even happened. There's dispute. I mean, most cosmologists think inflation happened, but not everyone does. So there's dispute about whether inflation happened, and certainly there's no data to tell us what happened before inflation at the moment. There might be in the future. Even then, I wonder whether you could really decide this issue with any kind of data. I don't know of any potential signal that would say, yes, that will show us the universe definitely has a beginning. Maybe someone will come up with something, but I don't think we have anything yet. I'm very sure we don't have anything yet.
Yeah, and I think that's the sort of one of the central takeaways from our discussion is that, quoting these select few physicists in these ways is not accurately representing the current state of science and the current state of cosmology. I think that is just the broader takeaway. And we've also looked at various different arguments here, the second law of thermodynamics. We've gone into the BGV theorem. We've talked about a lot of stuff. The objections from the illicit slide from finitude of the past to begins to exist. We've covered a lot of ground.